Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Today's topic is the market revolution. One of those subjects that at first glance doesn't seem like it's going to be super important. I mean, nothing really happens. There's no exciting plot that goes through, but I'm going to tell you it's the sleepy moments of the backstory that change absolutely everything. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's APUSH. History class rides again! We have two objectives today. By the end of this period, you should be able to, number 7, analyze how industrialization affected the American economy, and number 8, identify the significant elements of the market revolution. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 7. Here we're going to be in subpoint A and talk about the division of labor and the rise of the factory system. There was two great changes defining the early 19th century economy. The first was the growth of the mechanization of industry. We might refer to that as the Industrial Revolution. It started first in Great Britain and then appears in the United States shortly thereafter. And also the secondary expansion and integration of the markets, which we would call the market revolution. These two things put together, a changing understanding of the workplace, a changing understanding of manufacturing, and a changing understanding of how the marketplace would distribute those goods, sets up a huge moment of both economic growth but also social change. Industrialization came to the United States between sometime in the years of 1790 through about 1860. That 70-year period. I know it's a big, long time when you're trying to chunk it up into, APUSH history times, but the real world doesn't always fit with College Board numbering. Nevertheless, industrialization came to the United States between 1790 and 1860 as merchants and manufacturers increased the output of goods by reorganizing work and by building factories. The outwork system was a more efficient division of labor, and it lowered the cost of goods. But the outwork system was where a manufacturer would handle certain parts of the system and then the work would be done out of the factory by somebody else in certain ports. It was a more efficient division of labor, and it overall lowered the cost of goods, but it also eroded workers' control of the pace of their work and the conditions of their work, as well as the wages of their work. For tasks that weren't suited to the outwork model, factories were created where work was concentrated under one single roof and divided up into specialized tasks. Manufacturers used the newly improved coal-burning stationary steam engines to go power their mills. They used power-driven machines and assembly lines to replace new types of products. Previously to this, anytime a factory or mill needed to be built, it needed to be built next to a continuous water source. So the water, maybe running down a river, could go turn a water wheel, which could inside drive the machinery. But with the new technology and the improving technology of the steam engine, all of those things began to change. And in Great Britain, some Britons even feared that American manufacturers would become exporters, not only to foreign countries, but even to England, where England went through the Industrial Revolution first and modernized really first and jumped way out ahead in terms of economic and engineering levels. It looked like the American economy was going to catch up to them. Subpoint B. Now here we're going to focus on specifically textile construction, an issue that is near and dear to the English economy because really the backbone of the British economy was in textile production, but it also turns out that American manufacturers were really well suited to this also. Because British textile manufacturers, they were particularly worried about this new American competition. Britain prohibited the export of textile machinery and the immigration of mechanics who could go build it, but a lot of British mechanics would disguise themselves as like ordinary laborers and then set sail to the United States. When they arrived in the United States, they would be free from some of the old guild system and, class protections that were built into the English economy. Arriving in the United States, then they could go build a lot of these machines that were operating in Great Britain as well. And here I want to introduce Samuel Slater. Samuel Slater brought to America a design for an advanced cotton spinner. Its use in 1790 marked the advent of the American Industrial Revolution. Having seen British spinners in action, he reproduced one in America totally from memory, working without the benefit of plans and blueprints. Just from having seen one, he reproduced it. The American manufacturers, they could rely on this abundance of natural resources, including things like cotton and wool and water to go power the factories that were sprouting up along rivers in the northeastern states of the country. But British companies, they were better established. They had less expensive shipping rates, they had lower interest rates and cheaper labor. So with all of the other inputs of industry, Great Britain still had the advantage. Congress was passing protective legislation in 1816 and then in 1824 and then in 1828. They would levy high taxes on imported goods, and And by the 1830s, tariffs were reducing themselves. Congress was reducing the tariffs, and you see this back and forth tension of how you protect industry but also keep markets open. Subpoint C. Here we're going to talk about the growth of better machines and maybe even better workers. Because American producers used two other strategies to go compete with their British rivals. On one hand, they improved on British technology. The inventions which were being made in the old country were being dramatically improved on once arriving in the United States. And then second, they found less expensive workers. The greater number of people and the more resources allowed wages to come down. That's good for manufacturing, even if it's bad for the workers. American producers more effectively competed with their British rivals by improving on British technology. Take, for instance, Francis Cabot Lowell's Boston Manufacturing Company. He built the Waltham factory, the first technology to perform all of the cloth-making operations under one roof at higher speeds than even the British mills could handle it, but also with fewer workers, producing goods faster and more efficiently, which overall lowers the cost of the goods. The Boston Manufacturing Company pioneered a labor system that became known as the Waltham-Lowell system, in which the company recruited farm women and girls to leave the farm and come join the factories, and these textile workers, and then the girls would then work for lower wages than working men. They were sometimes referred to as the mill girls, and the mill girls were unmarried women, and in their capacity of work, they worked under very strict social and workplace rules. By the early 1830s, more than 40,000 women of New England were working in textile mills. Mill owners provided rooms and boarding houses and a place to live with, things to do in the evenings, cultural activities, but they also enforced strict curfews. They were prohibited certain pieces of lifestyle like alcoholic beverages, and they required church attendance. It wasn't just enough to be a good worker, you also had to be a good fit for the system. By combining that improved technology, but also efficient and low-paid female labor, but also tariff protection, protecting their exports, the Boston Manufacturing Company had sold textiles at cheaper prices than their previously superior British companies. Subpoint D. By the early 1820s, American-born craftsmen were replacing their previous, British peers and even betters with the cutting edge of technological innovation. For instance, mechanical institutes were established in a number of states, and they were disseminating technical knowledge and encouraging innovation for the craft. Take the year 1820. In 1820, the United States Patent Office was issuing maybe 200 patents a year, more or less. When you see the growth of patents, you're really seeing the growth and development of technological innovation and spurring on. By 1860, within the same lifetime, by 1860, the Patent Office was awarding 4,000 patents annually. And American mechanics were pioneering the development of new machine tools and fueling the spread of the Industrial Revolution. They were creating more efficient machines and speedier mass production. Take, for instance, the story of Eli Whitney. You may know of Eli Whitney as the man that invented the cotton gin, and we'll get there in a second, but Eli Whitney would also develop interchangeable parts and precision-crafted parts, where if you were taking, for instance, a tool apart, you could replace certain parts of that tool. They weren't made specifically for each people. They were standardized things that today we understand as like nuts and bolts have standard systems, and you could go to a hardware store and pick up pieces of them and they'll all fit together, or once you know the sizes, they'll fit together. Eli Whitney patents that idea or encourages that idea of those interchangeable parts, that the parts can be switched between them. That allows manufacture to happen more efficiently, but it also happens to be faster and cheaper and easier to work on the parts that come out of it. Those interchangeable and precision crafted parts enabled large-scale production. The increased availability of machines allowed the American Industrial Revolution to come of age, and the volume and the availability of output of some products, things like Remington rifles or Singer sewing machines or Yale locks, they truly became household names. And the 1851 Crystal Palace exhibition in London, this technological show that was one of the greatest in the world, Americans, going and visiting the Crystal Palace exhibition, started building factories in Great Britain, and you have American manufacturers with their, producing overseas, and soon we're dominating European markets as well. Subpoint E. The Industrial Revolution changed the nature of work and of workers' lives. American craft workers depended on an artisan republicanism, an ideology of production based on the principles of liberty and equality. These people of these eras saw themselves as small-scale producers. They were equal to each other and free to go work for themselves. That changed with the outwork system and the factory system, and as those things spread, more and more workers took jobs really not as independent craftsmen, but as dependent wage earners. Skilled workers, people like carpenters and masons, they united through a strong trade consciousness, and they created labor unions and began to bargain with their employers, particularly with the hope of setting a 10-hour workday, feeling that they were just being worked way to death. It probably feels like being a high school history teacher. By 1840, trade workers and federal employees successfully won that 10-hour workday. Artisans whose occupations were threatened by industrialization, people like shoemakers and printers and so on, they were less successful at bargaining for stronger positions, and some of them left their employers to go set up specialized shops. That resulted in a division of the traditional artisan class into basically two groups. You had self-employed craftsmen, but also wage-earning craftsmen. Under English and American common law, it was illegal for workers to form unions or to organize themselves for the purpose of raising wages, because that prevented the other workers from hiring themselves out for whatever wages they wished. So there was this understanding that, like, while unions were developing, they were developing for specifically skilled trades and not for manufacturing trades. Little number two, in 1830, journeymen began to band together to form mutual benefit societies to go seek better conditions. In 1834, several of these trade unions combined to form what's known as the National Trade Union. Although workers gained the public support for issues and their causes in a 1842 Supreme Court case known as Commonwealth versus Hunt, it upheld the rights of workers to go form unions and call strikes in order to enforce closed shop agreements. That limited employment to union members, and a lot of judges, though, still continued to issue injunctions forbidding strikes. So that's kind of a word soup that basically meant that the Supreme Court was allowing workers to create unions to go bargain for better rights, but at the same time, lower courts were denying that, and you have this question over how workers can join union shops, or if they have to, if they don't have to, and you're really getting a little behind-the-scenes action into labor law here of the mid-19th century. Union leaders then devised a labor theory of value, saying that labor itself has value, not necessarily the product that it's created, although it might also have value, but labor itself, the work is worth something. They organized strikes for higher wages. Women textile workers took on similar labor actions. Others refused to work in the mills altogether. They were soon replaced by impoverished Irish immigrants, though while native farm, American farm women, while they were refused to go into the shops, there was new people, immigrants showing up who would go take those jobs in their place. By 1857, surplus production and a financial panic, they contributed into the downward spiral of an economic recession, and urban employment rose to 10%. That reminded Americans of the social costs of industrial production, that while it does drive down the cost of goods, it also drives down the cost of labors, and it might leave Americans overall more poor. Subpoint F. Here we're going to talk about farming in the cotton kingdom of the South. Overall, America's output of wheat was increasing tremendously, in a large part to a technological development from a person named John Deere. Yes, it was an actual John Deere. And he developed the steel plow. Also, Cyrus McCormick developed a mechanical reaper that would go and harvest grain much more quickly. The North had a mixed economy of farms and manufacturing cities. Commercial agriculture, though, particularly with these developments of the steel plow and the mechanical reaper, they were dominating the South, and especially in cotton production. Cotton production was made possible by Eli Whitney's cotton gin. The cotton gin had an accidental result. While it did make cotton processing less labor intensive, it made widespread cotton farming far more profitable. That increased the demand for slavery. While individual cotton production wasn't quite as labor intensive, the overall growth of the cotton industry was labor intensive, and while yes, an individual cotton production might take less slaves to go do, the overall boom in cotton production spurred up towards the demand for slavery. After 1812, Southerners, many with slaves, poured into the territory west and south of the Appalachian Mountains, bringing slavery into the new territory. The domestic slave trade resulted in about 1 million slaves being sold from the upper South and South Carolina into the deep South, from the older slave states into the deep South between 1800 and 1860. Slave trading had become a well-organized business. Little number 3. By 1920, the United States was producing 170 million pounds of cotton. It was the nation's most important export. We often refer to it as the cotton kingdom of the South because King Cotton was such an important export. It was exporting to the rest of the world. The South was commercially oriented because of that easy production of cotton, but it remained overwhelmingly rural from the years 1800 through 1860. Frankly, they were just making so much money in cotton production, there wasn't a reason to go industrialize. There was no reason to go build factories. You would actually lose money in factory production or or developing other parts of your economy because cotton was making just so stinking much money. Subpoint G. Here I want to talk about the growth of cities and towns. Because of the expansion of industry and trade, the urban population grew fourfold between the years of 1820 and 1840. The most rapid growth was growing in these new industrial towns. And that's no surprise to any watcher of urban growth. Basically, when there's industry and there's jobs being available, you see the cities grow up in their place. And they sprang up along what's become known as the fall line. The fall line was like long rivers where there could be natural waterfalls that could turn water wheels. For example, in Lowell, Massachusetts, or Hartford, Connecticut, or Trenton, New Jersey, or Wilmington, Delaware. Western commercial cities like New Orleans and Pittsburgh and Cincinnati and Chicago, they grew almost as rapidly because their location at points where goods would transfer from one mode of transportation to another, taking off of carts and putting it onto boats, for instance. As transportation hubs, several cities like St. Louis and Chicago also became major manufacturing cities as well because they had the ability to go distribute the goods. By 1860, the largest cities in the United States were New York, Philadelphia, Brooklyn, St. Louis, and Chicago, basically in that order. The old Atlantic seaports, Boston and Philadelphia and Baltimore and Charleston, and especially New York City, they were also important, retaining their importance for foreign commerce and increasingly as centers of finance and small-scale manufacturing. New York's growth stemmed primarily from its control of foreign trade, and by 1840, New York handled almost two-thirds of the foreign imports, and almost half of all foreign trade came out of New York ports. In subpoint H, let's go turn our eyes westward, and here we see the intersection of both westward expansion, but also the understanding of freedom and the expansion of freedom. And we introduce here a new term for us known as manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is the idea that the United States seemed to be chosen by God, like an obvious and divinely appointed mission to occupy all of North America. That westward migration and the market revolution, it created a truly mobile population that was looking for new places to be. The West had more land and it was vital for economic independence. It was the social condition of freedom to seem like a person could go make their own money in the West. And national myth and an ideology, the West would long time remain as the last home of the freeborn American. The man could truly do what any American could do, whatever they wanted to, and the great open promise of the West. Roman numeral number 8. Here I want to talk about the market revolution and the development of the economic pieces that would make America rich. Subpoint A. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson believed that the Trans-Appalachian Road was necessary for unifying a young country. This might be hard for us moderns today to understand how hard travel was in a day before, I don't know, pavement or roads, or even, I mean, not even talking about like cars, but even before trains. I mean, just people were traveling over mud and rock roads, and long distance travel was very, very difficult, not to mention bumpy. But in 1806, Congress authorized the construction of this Trans-Appalachian Road, and President Jefferson signed the act establishing what becomes known as the National Road. It connected the Cumberland region of the Appalachian Mountains to Maryland to the Ohio River. It was the first federally funded road in U.S. history. In 1811, the first contract was awarded and they built the first 10 miles of the road. Eventually, the road was pushed through central Ohio and Indiana and reached Vandalia, Illinois by the 1830s, and there they ran out of money and construction ceased because of that lack of funds. But number 3, by the 1830s, the federal government was conveying part of the road's responsibility to the states through which it runs. So basically saying, like, this is a national road and it's important to our whole country, but states, you guys got to help pick up the cost of construction on it. Toll houses and toll gates were then built by the states, with the federal government taking responsibility for road repairs. So a toll house or a toll gate means that to go ride on that road, you have to go pay a fee to it. And that, because the state was constructing it, they would go and put the toll in to go build construction, but then the federal government would take on its maintenance and keep it up from there. As the work of the road progressed, the settlement pattern of towns and villages, the developing, they're still visible. The National Road became Main Street through a lot of these new towns and these early settlements. And the National Road became known as the Main Street of America. A growing manufacturing economy needed better infrastructure to get these materials into the factory. Basically, like, a factory is going to need cotton, so how do you get the stuff to the factory? Well, you use the National Road, use this new developing technology. That gets stuff to the factory, and then the factory is going to take all this cotton and they're going to weave it into cloth, and then spin it into thread and weave it into cloth, and then they've got to export it. Where does it go from there? It's going to go travel along the National Road and other pieces of the infrastructure. The National Road opened up the Ohio River Valley and the Midwest settlements for commerce. But things didn't just travel over land. We also had the development of a canal system growing up in America as well. Subpoint B. America's developed a waterborne transportation system of unprecedented size. It began with a government-subsidized program of building the Erie Canal. The New York Canal project had basically three things in favor. It had the support of New York City merchants who were willing to go back it. It had the backing of the governor and the gentle landscape that was west of Albany. All of those things combined with the political power, with the economic backing, and then just like the land was good for it, it made this new canal system connecting the Erie Canal connecting western New York to the ports in the east. The Erie Canal was completed in 1825, and it made New York City the major trade port, with what we think of as the Old Northwest. If you kind of imagine the Great Lakes area, kind of the areas, just a little bit of that, Ohio and Indiana, that's kind of the Old Northwest. And basically it takes New York and it makes it the corridor the Old Northwest can go using the Erie Canal, go export to the rest of the world. It brought prosperity to central New York and to western New York. It linked the economies of the Northeast and the Midwest, and it prompted a canal boom in other similar locations. The state-funded canal typified any internal improvements. By 1837, there was 3,000 miles of canals that had been built, really at a pretty great cost. They were expensive to do so. Some states actually borrowed so much money that the state went bankrupt in the 1837 financial panic. But this improved water transportation most dramatically increased the speed and lowered the expense of commerce. It's easier to ship over water than it is over land, particularly before, like motors and machinery and roads and trains. So if you can get it on the water, you're going to go way faster at much less cost to do so. So you see, like, the canals seem like they are the thing that's going to go, spur the future of industry. Steam-driven power was a proven technology, but a lot of skeptics thought that if you take a large, heavy, flame-driven engine and you set it on a wooden boat, that seemed like a recipe for kind of an expensive disaster. But in 1807, Robert Fulton demonstrated the feasibility of the steamboat, and he traveled 150 miles up the Hudson River, and he did it in just 32 hours. It was a breakneck pace to do so. His development of the first American steamboat ensured the success of waterborne transportation system. By 1811, steamboats were in use in the Mississippi River, and it seemed like that's the future that had arrived. Subpoint C. In 1808, the New York government granted to a person named Robert Livingston and to his business partner Robert Fulton the exclusive navigation privileges in all waters within the jurisdiction of that state, with boats moved by fire or steam for a term of 30 years. So basically, Livingston and Fulton together team up. They form a business that's going to be a steamship business, and they get a contract with the state of New York to basically say, if you're going to use a steamboat on any water in New York, then that is only belonging to Livingston and Fulton. They have the exclusive rights. They have a monopoly on steam or fire ship travel on any river in New York City. Livingston and Fulton subsequently petitioned other states and other territorial legislation for similar monopolies. They hoped to develop this national network of steamboat lines, but really only the New Orleans territory accepted their petition and awarded them a monopoly on the lower part of the Mississippi. Aware of the potential, though, of this new steamboat navigation, competitors began challenging Livingston and Fulton. They argued that the commerce power of the federal government was exclusive, and they superseded state laws, basically saying that these guys, they weren't allowed a monopoly anywhere in New York or anywhere else. The legal challenges followed, and in response, the monopoly attempted to undercut its rivals by selling them franchises or by buying their boats. So basically, once there's an economic competition between Fulton and Livingston and everybody else, once they start also putting steamships on waters, Fulton and Livingston team up together and say that we're either going to drive you out of business by cutting our rates down and just we will survive with better financial backing and you'll go out of business and then we'll have the waterways again. Or by buying their boats. If I just buy all of your resources, then you won't be able to sell your ships also. The the New Jersey governor, a person named Aaron Ogden, he tried to defy that monopoly, but he ultimately purchased a license from the Livingston and Fulton assignees in 1815. So at first he wanted to break the monopoly, but in 1815 he can't, so he buys the rights into their system. And they entered the business with a guy named Thomas Gibbons from Georgia. So Gibbons versus Ogden, remember those names. This is one of those great Supreme Court challenges that you'll be expected to know about. But the partnership collapsed 3 years later. And when that happened, Gibbons and Ogden, their business fell apart and they were no longer partners and they split up for them. The partnership collapsed. Then Gibbons operated another steamboat on what was Ogden's route. These former business partners, now they're competing on the same routes together between New Jersey and New York City. That had been licensed by the United States Congress under a 1793 law regulating trade along the coast. Basically, the question was, this river divides two states, and it opens up into the ocean. So who's going to control that? The New York or New Jersey or federal waters? And All of those pieces are coming together, and it's used in the Supreme Court. Does Ogden have the rights to have that exclusive river? Does Gibbons have it as water that's between two states, and you can't sell the rights to just one state with the waters? Gibbons' lawyer was a person named Daniel Webster. We've introduced Daniel Webster in our last class. He's one of the war hawks. Remember that name, Daniel Webster. Gibbons' lawyer was a guy named Daniel Webster, and he argued that Congress had the exclusive national power over interstate commerce. If that river's going between two states, that's interstate commerce, and that's not something that New York or New Jersey can go license. According to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution, and to argue otherwise would result in some confusing and contradictory of the local jurisdictional policies. If New York is licensing their river and New Jersey is licensing the river, and who's actually in charge of that river, they said that Daniel Webster was arguing that that was superseded by the federal government and that Gibbons should get that and Ogden's exclusive rights don't apply. The Court of Chancery in New York and the Court of Errors in New York, they found in favor of the Ogden case, and they issued an injunction to restrict Gibbons from operating his boats. So they said Ogden, has the rights to that river, not Gibbons, and so you don't have the right on it. Because Congress, though, so Gibbons appeals to the Supreme Court, and he says, okay, I didn't win in the New York courts, I'm going to go to the federal Supreme Court because this is obviously a matter of interstate commerce and we couldn't settle it here. So he appeals up to the Supreme Court, and arguing, just like he did in the state of New York, that the monopoly conflicted with federal law. Now, Congress has the right to regulate interstate commerce. That's in the Constitution to do so. So the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Gibbons and overturned what had been the Ogden win in New York, and the federal Supreme Court argues in favor of Gibbons. The case is remembered by today, and the reason why this is important, it may be the first moment where the federal government really began its expansion of power, saying that this was a state's power, or seemed like it was a state's power, but no, that's a federal power. And that's kind of why we look at Gibbons versus Ogden as one of those bookend cases in American history. Subpoint D. Here we want to talk about railroads and trade. We've talked about over land travel, but also over water travel. We also see the development of a new technology, that of railroads. The development of the railroad created ties between the Northeast and the Midwest, and by the 1860s, railroads became the main carrier of freight, essentially getting heavy freight off of the water and out of the overland roads and putting it onto the rails. The interregional railroad lines connected Midwestern cities with adjacent states, and it turned Chicago, for instance, into a great transportation center. Intel trains and steamboats, and the fastest that any person could travel was the speed of a horse. But these new technologies allowed commerce and communication to enter a brand new era. The improved trade and transportation networks allowed Southerners to go sell their cotton in the Northeast textile plants, but also foreign markets. Most Southern investors concentrated their resources in cotton and slaves. The Southern economy remained predominantly agricultural, and it generated less per capita income than the greater industrial economy, but it also concentrated the wealth in the hands of a few people. So essentially they were making so much money in cotton. Yes, overall the region was suffering, but the real power holders were increasing their wealth so much so that they didn't need to go diversify their economy, and they don't need to invest in things like trains to do so because cotton's a pretty good way to make money. Subpoint E. The corporate form of business organization became central to this new market economy. So a new development, a legal development of how business should operate, known as a corporation, became central to the new market economy. A corporation can fail. If I go out of, so I have a business, I have Kansas Teas, and it's my wife and I, we work this together, and it's a sole proprietorship. We are the company. And if Kansas Teas goes out of business, if we take on too much debt, then Mrs. Wahlberg and I have to go pay back all of the money from our company. And if somebody gets hurt, I don't know, because of our t-shirts, it's hard to imagine that would be. But if we had some kind of liability where somebody got hurt, Mrs. Wahlberg and I would be personally liable for it. It's a sole proprietorship, but its new development becomes known as a corporation. And if you hear the word corpus in there as a body, as like creating a new thing, then you're on the right track for understanding what is a corporation. The corporate form of business organization became central to the new market economy. A corporation can fail without ruining its owners, its board of directors, or its shareholders. Not that anybody wants a corporation to fail, but if investors can minimize the chance that their business might ruin their lives, then they're more likely to start a business. And a corporation becomes maybe an advantageous way that people could take some risks on growing the economy. Many Americans distrusted corporate charters, though. They said this is a form of government-granted special privilege. And if a person is really going to go take the risk of starting a business, then it needs to be some kind of a personal risk. And maybe you're just creating a legal entity to allow people to go fast and loose and creating, fictitious people or fictitious organizations which seem to be destined to go out of business. Subpoint F. The improvements in transportation and communication were made possible by the rise of the West as a powerful, self-conscious region in the new nation. By the 1840s, the Indians were being removed, and generous federal land policies were increasing Western growth, and the desire for land ownership had enticed nearly 5 million people to move to the Trans-Appalachian West, crossing those Appalachian Mountains and move into some of the new territory. People established in groups, and they cooperated with each other to go clear land and build houses and barns and establish communities. You also see the development of squatters. Now, I guess you're not developing squatters. It's kind of an old thing, but it may be a new term for you. A squatter is a person that just moves onto land that isn't theirs, and they just stay there long enough, and eventually they build a house, and people just understand, well, okay, that's theirs, and they become squatters. So squatters would set up farms on unoccupied land and just kind of claim it for themselves. Many Americans settled in without any regard to national boundaries. There's, a territory that belongs to the United States and territory that belongs to Spain and France and Indian country, and Americans just kind of moved in and said nobody's using this here, and just moved into that area. And a lot of Florida, for instance, fell into the hands of Americans, despite the fact that there was Indian resistance and Spain's initial refusal to even sell Florida. It wasn't our land, but Americans just kind of ended up there. The Adams-Onis Treaty led to the United States gaining eastern Florida from Spain and then uniting it with the previously annexed West Florida, kind of putting it together. By the 1840s, by 1840, 7 million Americans were living west of the Appalachian Mountains. Ohio, by 1850, by 1850, Ohio was the third most populous state, a state that's still really important, curiously populated Ohio. People kind of forget about it. It's one of those states in the middle, but come election season, Ohio always matters a whole lot. This change in the economic condition, this change in the economic situation, the development of industry, the development of infrastructure, the development of new business techniques, all of those things would push together to advance the American economy and to advance, the understanding of what Americans thought of themselves. That changing thought of self will set up all kinds of new future for the history of America, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.